Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 16 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and will support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Okay, we are going to, again, 3 papers, and then we'll talk this week about the midweek review, video review as well. So the points this week is the end of Chevron deference. So this is nothing to do with military topics or international relations, strictly a U.S. Constitutional issue. The implications of the Russia-North Korea Defense Pact. A summary of events leading to the Declaration of Independence since July 4th was this week, and the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 7. So this week we're going to start talking about the Supreme Court made a ruling on Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. Loper Enterprises is a New Jersey-based herring fishing company, and it filed a case against the Department of Commerce, which is at this point Raimondo. I think it's Janet Raimondo, but I'm not 100% sure. Wasn't even thinking about it. Sorry. She is the current administrator of the Commerce Department. Now, this is a case where often they've argued this is conservative versus Democrat. The 6-3 ruling indicates that, yes, this is a conservative decision. This is not, this one has history going back to the President Trump administration where the case was initiated, and the Biden administration chose to defend this. So this is not a case of right versus left, Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative. This is actually a case of executive authority and the legislature basically surrendering its constitutional duties to the executive branch, which is the branch of the president. So that's what this was, a 6-3 ruling. It did not get as much, obviously, did not get as much airplay as the immunity case. But I actually think this is more relevant to restoring the power dynamics between the 3 branches of government. Just so everybody's clear, the branches of government are the executive branch, the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and all the federal courts underneath. So those are the 3 branches of government. So again, this was seen as a win for the right, reducing the power of the executive branch and increasing the power of the judicial branch. Of course, they look at it from this point of view because this is taking away power from President Biden. So obviously, this is a right-wing decision, and there might be an act of certainly not naive to sit there and say this is a conservative decision. That was going after the left. I will go through that and just realize that this is not anything to do with. In the end, it was actually a win for rebalancing the balance between the 3 branches of government. So, and it actually does not add power to the judicial branch, and I'll go through that here shortly as well. So the case originated from the 1976 Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act that required federal monitors on fishing boats to ensure compliance and prevent overfishing. So the President Trump administration's Department of Commerce, which I think was led by Wilbur Ross, enacted a rule requiring fishing boats to pay a $700 fee for the required monitor, which is a pretty steep cost for any small business operation. And they had to have a monitor when they went out and fishing. So every time they go out, they're having to plunk down $700 for a federal monitor. And this was initiated under the Trump administration. So the ruling was seen as a win for, I guess going back to this only impact, this particular case only impacted the Atlantic fisheries. The Pacific fisheries, for some weird reason, already had a payment structure or finance structure for the monitors in the Pacific fisheries. So this weird thing about how to fund monitors in the Atlantic fisheries, again, why it was left out for the Atlantic but not in the Pacific, I'm sure it's probably got something to do with some other act that probably elapsed that changed the status of the Atlantic fisheries. Well, anyway, this particular case only impacted the Atlantic fisheries. Again, this is actually a win for the supporters of the democratic process, as it restores the balance of government power and returns power to the citizens of the United States. So this is how I'll try to explain how that impacts the why it does shift power back to the citizens. So the doctrine of Chevron deference. Let's see here. So the Act of Chevron, which grants the Department of Commerce the authority to interpret vague laws used in this case. Well, Chevron deference was actually a case back in 1980. I think it might have been initiated in 81. It was Chevron, the oil company, versus the Environmental Protection Agency. This was a case taken up and defended by the Reagan administration, and it actually granted in the end, the court sided with the government and said that the agencies, in this case the Environmental Protection Agency, was granted wide authority to interpret vagueness in the law. And the idea was, hey, these are the people that run the APA. They're the experts. They're going to come up with the best doctrine, the best regulation, and these are who we should go. These are the ones that should be interpreting vague laws. So you can see where this goes, is that these rules basically had the power of law, and they were giving the EPA or any federal agency under the executive branch the power to interpret laws. So what was happening was, in practice, the Congress was purposely writing vague laws and then allowing the government, the executive agency, the executive branch, it's administration agencies like Department of Commerce, Department of Education, Defense Department. You could go into some of the step down departments, the Environmental Protection Agency, the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It goes into all these different agencies where purposely vague rules could be interpreted by the experts. So a very Wilsonian view of that the experts should actually be making a determination of what is law in the country. That's talking about Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during World War I, and basically the big promoter of the administrative state. And the idea was experts should be the ones making basically laws to make the country run better. That was his point of view. So what was happening is the Chevron deference started going into is agencies were no longer, or Congress was purposely passing vague laws, leaving it up to the agencies to fill in the gaps. And then Congress's idea is that they would go back into oversight and they would go after the executive branch, whoever party. If it's Democrats run Congress and there's a Republican president, they're going to put the department head on the grill and complain about these rules and regulations, and they often, meaning Congress, grandstands. And they're doing this instead of actually fixing the vagueness in the law. So they were purposely abdicating their duties as lawmakers to the executive branch. And then they would just go in and Congress would grandstand in these hearings and not actually accomplish anything, when maybe instead of hearings, they should have brought in experts, address the vagueness in the law, and pass a new law, amend the current law, and go through the lawmaking process. But instead, they were just wanting to, Congress was expecting the executive agencies to fill in the gaps in the purposeful vagueness of the laws, and then either side, excuse my language, can bitch about it afterwards during committee hearings. It just becomes a circus that goes on in the U.S. Congress. So the Supreme Court reversed this practice, and the reports, the media says this was granting federal courts the power of interpretation. And so the idea was that this was not actually giving power back to the legislative branch. It was taking power from the executive branch and giving it to the court. And my argument is these media that reported this out, and this got quickly overshadowed by the immunity case, is the media is getting stuck in the interim phase of the judicial process. Yes, the judicial process will go in there and says, yep, where you, Mr. Agency, cannot make this decision because of purposeful vagueness in the law. And then, so the court has that power saying, no, you cannot create this law, Mr. Executive Branch. We will, but this doesn't mean that you can interpret from the bench either. The idea is that the federal government vacates the law and pushes it back for vagueness. So it requires if the executive branch agency wants address of this particular issue, once it's been ruled against by the court, it has to go back to Congress. And Congress and the executive branch have to work together to specifically address the vagueness in the law. So there are no more rulemaking on vague laws. It will require that the court goes in there, they take, as I said, this media says they take power of it. They take power enough to rule on it it goes back to Congress. And this has been very common, even in the current court under Chief Justice John Roberts. He does not like the judiciary to rule on or make an interpretation of law passed by Congress. And if it's vague, to push it back, do not make a ruling on it and have it forced back into Congress to be reviewed. So the ruling in this interpretation by the media is just part of the hyperpolarized politics in the United States. And this is where it gets crazy, is that this is so bad that a conservative Supreme Court has ruled against the Biden administration. But the Biden administration was defending a Trump administration policy. So the 6-3 conservative court ruled against a policy of President Trump and a policy of President Reagan. And they probably did this because it was the Biden administration who was putting it forward to be defended. Now, if it was the Trump administration putting up with the 6-3, it probably would not have been a 6-3. It would have been a 5-4 either way. Because one thing I talk about this when I talk about taking away immunity from the judicial branch, or specifically judges, is you can almost determine where a case that has some type of political ramifications, you can almost guess which direction it will go in the lower courts, in the appeals court, and the Supreme Court based on whoever appointed that judge. And that's really a sad fact of what the government is. So what was happening was the conservative Supreme Court ruled against the Trump and Reagan administration because, and you probably argue, is they were more open to the arguments of the plaintiff because the Biden administration was pressing this position. Now, having said all that, I think it's, in my personal opinion, it's the right decision because the regulations that are enforced by these executive branch agencies, for example, the EPA, have the power of law. And because of purposeful vagueness or unintentional vagueness, and they get to fill in the gaps, these executive branch agencies, because of way a lot of these regulations, most of the regulations are, is these executive agencies get to interpret, they get to basically review evidence, and issue fines. So they're basically serve as the judge, jury, not really the judge, the legislative branch, and the executive branch by issuing fines. So it's really an imbalance in the government that the Congress has basically gotten lazy. They pass so many laws, and instead of they just push these through, and they let the executive branch handle it, the experts in the executive branch handle it, instead of maybe, just maybe you just go and you have the hearings ahead of time. You create good law with no vagueness. You get inputs from the experts. They go through the typical lawmaking and infighting process within Congress and within the committees, and then they create a law that is not vague. Instead of creating a vague law and then calling a hearing 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, and just bring in their panels of experts, bring in the head of the government agencies, and hold these grandstanding hearings about how unfair this application of these regulations are. Instead of having all that wasted energy in the back end, which makes no difference, because what happens when it's regulations, the executive branch, when it changes presidents, can just simply change regulations. They say, hey, you, Mr. Commerce Secretary, or you, Miss Commerce Secretary, change that regulation to meet my political agenda. What would happen now is that Congress, instead of having all this back end, is the administrations cannot change the regulations on the whims of the executive branch changing, or maybe they were trying to poll cat, which means they were just going the winds of whatever the polls say and making some policy. They cannot make the change. They cannot change the regulation. Now, I'm not naive to sit there and say the executive branch can make a decision to enforce the law or not, so they could simply ignore a law that they don't like. That's a problem in itself, and there is a remedy to it. It's called impeachment. And I'm not talking about impeachment of the president or a judge, but you can impeach lower level cabinet secretaries and executive heads of the agencies. So it's, my point is they can actually go in there, meaning Congress and the executive branch can work at the front end and still get expert testimony and inputs on how to create the best possible law. And then we won't have so many grandstanding hearings about calling in experts and just complaining and just making nice sound quotes, actually working on laws up front. That means that Congress has to spend more time making lawmaking and making better laws. They might actually reduce the number of laws because they actually have to craft laws and have more input from experts, have hearings on it, than just simply pass a vague law on a voice vote, pass it through, and then just let the executive agency write the vague regulation. They can't do that anymore. So I think in the end, it's actually going to make better law, and it will make the government more consistent and not to the whims of whatever executive. You might not like this ruling now because your team's in charge. Guarantee you, your team will not be in charge at some point, and they will make a change in those regulations that you may not like. So, again, this is actually a win for rebalancing the power distribution between the three branches of government. So I talked a little bit about the way the court's divided, and they said, okay, this is a 6-3 ruling. Conservatives voting for the overturning of a Trump and Reagan policy. So talked about that, and that there is something to be said that whoever's presenting the case and whoever's in power is whoever appointed those judges. I'm not talking just about Supreme Court. I'm talking about all federal judges. You can almost see anything that's of political nature, how they're going to vote based on who appointed them. It works 80% of the time. So the Supreme Court is divided into three parts. So they talk about a 6-3 conservative majority, and it's actually not. It's actually a 3-3-3 court. There's three parts that are conservative originalists. The other ones I call center-right moderates. There's three of them. I think Robert Barnes, who has a number of shows, he's also an active lawyer. He calls them the corporatists, which I think is probably a pretty good description. And then you have the liberal wing of the court. So in the conservative originalists, that's Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch. The center-right moderates, or the corporatists, are Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and John Roberts, the Chief Justice. And then the liberal branch is Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. So you would think that, so this is not really a 6-3 conservative-leaning court. It is a center-right court. You can't really argue with that. There are 6 judges that were justices that were nominated by Republicans. So oftentimes when it's something of political nature, they do rule for their teams. You see that. So the division, even though it's a 3-3-3 or 6-3, however you want to do it, I'd still stick to that. It's a 3-3-3. Is this division actually does create a number of 9-0 rulings, a surprising number, often resulting in criticism of the court's voting process. So they say, okay, this is a conservative court. But a lot of times they rule 9-0. Now, part of that is because John Roberts doesn't like, the Chief Justice does not like to have wide sweeping changes or rulings. He likes to be narrowly focused. So often does create 9-0 rulings. Does mean that oftentimes things that go before the court, they get these narrow rulings that are unanimous. Goes back to the lower courts, and oftentimes these lawsuits get overridden or get resubmitted outside of the narrow decision of ruling, and the process just goes on and on. You can talk about the cake issues in I think Colorado. You could go into the gun issues of Bruin as an example of where even though the court has already ruled on it, it always seems to come back. So that's the one disadvantage of these narrow rulings. But again, this, for a divided court, they do provide a surprising number of 9-0 and 8-1 rulings. The press and politicians often perceive the Supreme Court as partisan and base their votes on ideology. And this is a common strategy. The ruling limits, so what we run into is like, I'll go into this is like, for example, I wish I could remember the case that came out this week. It wasn't the immunity case, but you had one case where Amy Coney Barrett voted with the on a 5-4 ruling. John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor voted in the minority, and Ketanji Brown Jackson and Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh voted in the majority. So there's oftentimes where they're flipping sides in that center right, and there's number of targets so that when you get outside of political rulings, you'll see a surprising number of crossovers in that area. Pretty solid that you're going to have Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch, for the most part, are going to rule one direction. Everybody else is kind of subject to change. So it's not as politically ideologue as it is often portrayed. Now, I think I've already mentioned this, is that just talk about this ruling, going back to Chevron deference, it limits bureaucrats' capacity to formulate regulations. Means that administration's political ideology cannot influence as administrations change. Congress cannot defer its lawmaking powers to the executive branch. It will make government function slower and more deliberate, and that's actually a good thing. Government wasn't supposed to be this rapid process of just cranking out based on whatever the political whims. that is not part of a Republican form of government. That is more of a Democratic form of government. When you talk about the old style democracy versus republic, that's where you run into a republic is purposely supposed to be more deliberative. So this actually should slow down the function of the federal government. Laws will need to be clear and concise and not subject to the political whims of whatever administration's in power. It is a win for the democratic process. Now, one thing I did talk about is that as more deliberative, time-consuming deliberation to create laws should reduce the number of laws being created, and you could probably start seeing more being moved to the states as the 10th and I think the 14th Amendment, but definitely the 10th, where powers that are not specifically granted to the federal government is granted to the states. You could start seeing the states filling in and actually providing a more localized administration of whatever laws the federal government is no longer covering. And that is actually a good thing, because as you get in these state legislatures, they're closer to the citizens of their states. So it becomes much more representative of what the people of those particular states want in their process, compared to a one-size-fits-all coming out of Washington. So more to come. Oftentimes you see these big rulings come down. It becomes Chicken Little, the sky is falling. But then once it actually starts getting enacted and you start seeing states filling the gaps, you actually end up seeing more effective law. It's a democratic process is messy, so there will be a lot of infighting over this. But I think in the end, this is actually a very good thing for the democratic process and representative, where government represents the people. So I think this is actually a very good decision. So a little bit off the beaten path, talking about constitutional issues. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I am not giving legal advice. I think that's the standard line. It's just interesting how this is actually going to change for the better, how laws will impact people's lives. It will make the Congress more effective. It will make the Congress and the executive branch work closely if they can actually get past their issues of working together. And if they don't work together, the states are going to fill the gaps. So there you go. So the implication of the Russia-North Korea Defense Pact. So this actually stemmed, there's been ongoing support from North Korea to Russia. The North Koreans have provided missiles, ballistic missiles to the Russians for the war in Ukraine, and they actually have evidence that North Korean ballistic missiles, which are against multiple sanctions, international sanctions, were used in Ukraine. The North Koreans did provide artillery shells, at least 1 million, to the Russians as they try to increase their capacity of production. So they did buy a lot of artillery shells from the North Koreans for an unspecified amount of support from Russia. So on a side note, funny thing, I read a number of articles that the North Korean made artillery shells had serious lacking in quality control, and even compared to Russian standards. So if you didn't know if they undercharged or overcharged the rounds, so you assume, hey, we're going to fire this thing and it's going to go 10 kilometers, 6 miles, and it actually goes only 4. So you fall short and you could be bombing your own troops, or it could overshoot and so not hit the target as intended. So I've not seen what percentage of the shells were impacted, but again, there was a significant number of reports from different agencies reporting that there was quality assurance problems with the North Korean artillery shells. So I can believe that. Anything you see coming out of North Korea, you look at there, is like, yeah, I can believe that. So the current defense pact is basically stemmed out of the NATO's agreement on the limited use of Western donated weapons to be used against Russia in the war in Ukraine. The NATO foreign ministers agreed to this on May 2024 to allow the limited use of Western donated weapons against Russia. This was an agreement that was pushed, or a issue pushed by France and Ukraine, eventually adopted by the United Kingdom. This agreement that was reached at the end of May was less than what France, the UK, and Ukraine wanted, but it was a significant escalation to the war. Now, President Vladimir Putin of Russia vowed retaliation, like he often does, against the West, but did not specify, as he often does, what the retaliation would be. That's part of strategic ambiguity. Also might be, oftentimes it seems like he's got nothing to really retaliate with without causing a significant risk of escalating the war. So in this case, after this decision to use weapons, or allow the use of Western weapons inside Russia, Russia sent two warships to conduct missile drills off the U.S. coast while en route to Cuba, and threatening to, and also after U.S. ATACMS missiles were used in Crimea, with one, well, the Russians say 5 were shot down. I can't verify, but you do have film where one is shot down, and its warhead, which was a cluster munition, exploded at a Crimean beach, killing 4. And they make the point, 2 children. I'm not doubting that, and 150 wounded. That was, even though it didn't hit its target, when the warhead exploded, it sprayed the beach with shrapnel, or cluster munitions. And so after that, the Russians stated that they consider the U.S. a direct combatant in the war. What that means, not sure. The Russians are talking about shooting down U.S. unmanned drones that operate in the international waters in the Black Sea. Be interesting to see what happens on this. So the most concerning action, though, and this is probably the true retaliation, is the Russian, that President Putin's state visit to North Korea seemed like the real retaliation. And he visited there on June 19th, 2024, and signed a number of agreements. So the most concerning is the agreement includes a mutual defense treaty, similar to the 1961 treaty that, I think it was 1961, signed between North Korea and the Soviet Union, that expired when the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991. So it basically is bringing back that. It's also bringing cooperation, investment, trade, science, and technology, and a provision for developing military and technical cooperation with North Korea. So this raises questions about what does it. So the Mutual Defense Treaty does have something very similar to NATO, that if one country is attacked, the other one will provide aid to that country. Now, what designates an attack to trigger this? It's a mutual defense treaty. So this is not a one-way treaty. This is a mutual treaty. So if the Western weapons are used to attack targets inside Russia, does that trigger that mutual defense agreement? And remind you is that the Russians say that the U.S. is now a direct combatant in the war. And you have this particular agreement that states that if a country attacks the other will come to the aid. So does, again, the use of Western donated weapons attacking inside Russia, trigger that pact. Now, Putin says it might, and it has to be considered. So again, he's putting that purpose ambiguity into his statements. But the West doesn't know. But what we do see is that the North Koreans are sending, or going to send, up to four Army engineering brigades to parts of the occupied Donbass, which is part of Ukraine prior to the 2022 invasion. So, and North Korea is getting direct financial aid. So the North Koreans are providing weapons, and now they're sending troops. Now, they say these are going to help rebuild the city, and that's probably true, but what that does is that relieves Russian units from having to do that job, or if these units are going to serve as occupation forces, that frees up Russian troops to focus on the front, as the North Koreans will obviously have to secure those parts of the that they are working in. If they're truly engineer brigades, they would have to secure their own area that they're operating in. So the size and scope of the North Korean operations is still up for debate because we don't know the West doesn't know what that means. So there could be more North Koreans entering the battle, especially if that mutual defense treaty comes in. The other concern with that mutual defense treaty is that the South Koreans are concerned that it could draw in the Russians into a conflict with South Korea. So the South Koreans are not taking this particularly well either, and they really shouldn't. And now they're talking about providing direct aid to the Ukrainians, which is something they have avoided up to now. So there is, I'm an economist, and as we say, nothing is free, there's a cost to everything. And so we'll see where that one goes. But if they're actually the South Koreans will actually do it, or if it's just a threat. North Korea has touted that the alliance with Russia is justified, mentioned that NATO reaches out and has partnerships with the Indo-Pacific 4 nations, which are specifically targeted against China and North Korea. And so they state that this, from their point of view, the North Koreans, this is a fully justified alliance as the West, the U.S., and is forming alliances against the North Koreans. So going to about the part of the advanced weapons is, so you've got this mutual defense treaty, don't know what it means, but there's a lot of vagueness, and that's purposeful. And it seems to be having some type of an effect on U.S. policy because also 2 weeks ago, or I guess it was last week, as the call was 2 weeks ago, Lloyd Austin called the Russian foreign minister shortly after the attack or the shoot down of the American ATACMS missile in Crimea. So it seems to be this is having some type of moderating effect on the use of U.S. weapons, which would mean that Putin's policy was successful by doing this. It hasn't completely eliminated the use of American-made weapons, but it looks like it has caused some type of restraining effect on how the weapons are used. Not saying that will hold up. I do know that the White House is very much like a Lyndon Baines Johnson management of the Vietnam War. It's very much controlled out of the White House. So I would not be surprised that the White House just pumped the brakes on how weapons are used because they don't want to lose control of how this war is being fought. So we talked about the advanced weapons. So the Russians' proposal is to supply North Korea with advanced weapons. This is outside the Mutual Defense Treaty. So Russia pledges to supply North Korea with advanced weapons and enhance their current weapons lethality. So the agreement's clause directly responds to NATO's countries' decisions to permit the use of their weapons against Russian targets. So what this does is that it allows North Koreans to use Russian-made weapons the same way Ukraine can use Western-made weapons against Russia. So it kind of gives North Korea a free rein. Now, not saying that North Korea is going to choose to do this, but it also appears there's almost a laissez-faire approach from the Russians. I think they stated it was one of their, I'm not sure if there's foreign minister or assistant foreign minister, basically said that they're allowed to use these weapons however they want, meaning North Korea. So the concern is that these Russian weapons will be sold globally to whoever the North Koreans decide to sell them to. So the one question, though, is obviously Russia is under a tremendous amount of sanctions. There's being more pressure put on China for dual-use weapons. Not sure how far that will go. China can't jump completely into the Russian camp because they can't give up Western trade, and they already have some headwinds in their economy. So they can't go full. The Chinese can't go full in on the Russian side of the war. So the question comes in with Russia having to bring in North Korean weapons, including ballistic missiles, bringing in Iranian weapons, mainly through the use of drones. Is how does Russia expect to be able to support transfer of advanced weapons to North Korea when it is now a net importer of military equipment, and it lacks a sophisticated electronics industry right now to be able to create that? So it seems like this is more name only. They can provide maybe a few advanced weapons, maybe a few advanced aircraft, but it's not going to be, as long as this war in Ukraine is going on, this is not going to be a large transfer of weapons. This is more in name only. The bigger concern is the technology transfers, not the actual made weapons, but what they can do, the Russians can do to help the North Koreans. They can do technology like weapons, more advanced weapons that allow to see if the North Koreans can copy them, especially if they get Chinese support. Satellite support, more advanced spy satellites that the Russians have to be able to provide direct support to the North Koreans, especially when you're talking about advanced targeting for weapons. And they can also provide advisors to help North Korea improve their domestic weapons programs. With Russian assistance, North Korea can perfect and operationalize a number of its weapons. Like, for example, they've started to use solid rocket, or they're testing solid rocket fueled ICBMs and other missiles, like the Hwasong 18, which is said to be able to reach the U.S. Why solid rocket booster or solid rocket motored ICBMs is so important is they don't need to be fueled prior to launch. So you don't often store liquid fueled rockets for long terms in a silo. You fuel them up when you think it's going to be that they might need to be used. So it's much harder to be a first strike weapon because you can intelligence can get indication that weapons or missiles are being fueled. You don't have to do that with solid rocket fuel. So this would actually, if the North Koreans can perfect this, and if the Russians assist them, they will be able to provide. North Korea will be able to perfect its solid rocket fueled ICBM. Also, the Russians can also help with miniaturization of warheads. Not sure if they will go that far, but we don't know. And they can also work with re-entry vehicles for missile systems. So you'll get satellite support for targeting from the Russians. You will get technology support in the form of possibly in nuclear warhead miniaturization. Also in how to do a re-entry vehicle on top of a solid rocket fueled ICBM. And just think how that changes the balance of power if Korea decides to initiate a war with South Korea. Not saying they will, because South Korea is extraordinarily powerful, on the Korean Peninsula, the North Koreans could threaten the U.S. with launch of attacking Washington or the United States, not just Washington. They could attack the United States with an ICBM if they interfere, meaning the U.S. interferes in a North Korean-initiated Korean War. Of course, we have missile defense systems, but eventually, are they going to be the North Koreans be able to create more ICBMs than what the missile defense system can shoot down? So it is a destabilizing decision if the Russians go through with the worst case scenario. Again, we don't really know because they haven't really advertised what they're going to provide, but they could provide a lot, and it could be extraordinarily destabilizing in that region of the world. So the South Korean president, Yoon Suk Yeol, excuse me if I mispronounce that, condemned the agreement as a threat to his country's security and a violation of UN resolution. The other thing that kind of stands in with that is that China view on this initiative is uncertain, as Russia visited North Korea and Vietnam and signed several agreements in the region, and it's considered within the Chinese sphere of influence. What is the Chinese going to think if the Russians provide more advanced weapons to the North Koreans and make them more powerful? Not saying the North Koreans would ever turn against the Chinese, but they will become less reliant on the Chinese and maybe more independent or possibly more reliant on Russia than the Chinese. So this could erode China's influence over North Korea. The other side of it is the agreements that Putin signed with Vietnam. China is in a number of disagreements with Vietnam, mainly over the Gulf of Tonkin, territorial waters, and the South China Sea. So Russia has gone in there and inserted itself into two Chinese sphere of influences. So not sure how China is going to view these initiatives. Not saying this is going to split them apart, but one thing that kind of stands out was, remember, Vietnam, during the height of the Vietnam War, Russia and China were, even though they're both communist countries, did not like each other. They distrusted each other, and they were hostile to each other. They did fight some minor border wars, but when you go into the Vietnam War, obviously, the U.S. was involved in fighting on the South Vietnamese side. The North Vietnamese, even though they bordered China, and they, according to the Rand Corporation, there were some Chinese volunteers in the North Vietnamese army. For the most part, the Communist Party alignment of Vietnam was solidly on the Soviet side, and less on the Chinese side, where, and also in Cambodia, which also expanded U.S. involvement during the Vietnam War, was when the Khmer Rouge took over that country. The Khmer Rouge communists were much more aligned with the Chinese communists. And the Khmer Rouge their reign of power was ended when the Vietnamese, again, the Soviet-aligned Vietnamese, invaded Cambodia and occupied Cambodia and basically displaced the Khmer Rouge into the jungle, kicked them out of power, displaced them as a guerrilla movement in the jungles of Cambodia. And again, the Khmer Rouge were aligned with the Chinese. So these things are remembered. The Putin trying to expand keep his country from being so isolated is starting to expand into other areas. And this move into North Korea and Vietnam, concerning some of the history, and also moving into the Chinese sphere of influence, it's not sure how the Chinese are going to approach this. So, um, so again, it goes into the West's decision to permit the use of donated weapons against Russian targets has led to this Russian threats. And now with this additional questions caused by this decision, and we will call it a very unstable North Korea. So this might be an actual legitimate retaliation if he can follow through. I do have doubts that they can physically follow through. A little concerned about how they will approach the mutual defense treaty. I don't say that we're going to see 100,000 North Korean troops running all through Ukraine, but nobody can say that for sure. So I think they're going to have a dampening effect on the use of donated weapons to certain targets. And you might see targeting guidelines coming out of the White House of how these weapons are to be used to keep that escalation from coming. But the more concerning thing to me, I think, is the technology transfers and the actual support, expertise that the Russians can give the North Koreans that is probably more detrimental than anything else. So, summary of events leading to the Declaration of Independence. More Americana if you didn't get enough from Chevron deference. So the American Revolution, obviously, the U.S. declared independence on July 4th, 1776, when the 13 British colonies declared their independence from Great Britain and King George III. It actually has a long journey, so I'm not going to hit all these points, but the French and Indian War started in 1754, and it started just before the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. The French Indian War was fought on the North American continent. 7 Years' War was fought on a wider stage, including Europe. The war ended in a French defeat. The war ended in the Treaty of Paris, which forced France to cede most of their North American colonies to Britain, and parts went to Spain. The war caused a big British national debt, and this is where the separation started coming between the colonies and Great Britain. So the British proclamations that the colonies needed to help pay off this debt because it was the British that provided security to the colonies, and the colonies needed to help pay off this debt, even though the colonies had no say-so in the British Parliament. They were not allowed to vote. So again, remember, taxation without representation. So the British decided that the colonies needed to help pay the national debt, and they had no say-so in Parliament. So other thing came of King George. The decision to tax the colonists for the security and provided by the British over the 7 Years' War. It forbade the colonists from moving deeper within settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains in 1763, because the idea is they didn't want these colonists getting out of the range of the tax man. So they wanted to keep the American colonists within range of British regulators and British taxmen, so that they could not move. So it told them you cannot move beyond Appalachia, and if you did so, you were violating a decision by King George III. So after 1763 and the end of the war, so you start seeing the actual implementation of all those taxes. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act were all taxes imposed between 1764 and 1765. The Quartering Act is what led to later on, during the U.S. Constitution, the Third Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which does not allow the quartering of troops. That's where that came from, is because the Quartering Act, drawing back from the 7 Years' War. The British Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act in 1765, but the Declaratory Act was passed in its place in 1766. The the Stamp Act, from my understanding, is it basically put a tax on all legal activities in the U.S. So, for example, or not the U.S., the colonies. If a lawyer requested some type of legal document, that was taxed. I believe that's where it kind of, and there's some other parts in there. It was an unusual thing of what you would tax, especially if you look at it today in our world. So the British Parliament did repeal it in 1765, but the Declaratory Act was passed, which reaffirmed the Parliament and the Crown's authority over the colonies. And then, there's still more to come. The Boston Non-Importation Agreement of 1768, which led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. That, again, another regulation against trade in New England. Ended up sending more troops to Boston. And then the Tea Act was passed to help the British East India Company sell through its tea in its overcrowded warehouses in the dockyards of London. So this obviously, because of all these different taxes, the smuggling trade become much more pervasive in the American colonies to avoid taxation. So the idea was that all this extra tea that was sitting in these London warehouses were going to be sold in the colonies, and they were going to be sold at a rate less than what the smugglers, basically it would put the tea smugglers out of business. It's funny that tea was smuggled in the 1770s when you look at what's smuggled nowadays. But I guess we all had their vices, and I guess tea was a vice I guess it could be considered a vice. I don't know. But just funny that that's what selling cheap tea was going to put smugglers out of business in North America. So that sparked the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. The first Continental Congress was called in 1774, calling on the colonies to establish and train militias, and sent a letter to the King George and the Parliament demanding the repeal of what's called the Intolerable Acts, which was acts that were implemented in response to the Boston Tea Party by the British Parliament. The Intolerable Acts are the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston from all commerce and ordered Boston citizens to pay a large fine to compensate for the tea destroyed that was going to be sold at a cheap price, destroyed during the Boston Tea Party. The Massachusetts Government Act, which was an election of most government officials, were moved to the control of the Crown. This enhanced the power of the military governor and replaced elected government councils with appointed ones. The other part of the Intolerable Act was the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed trials of British officials charged with capital offenses to have their trials moved to another colony, which would be considered to be more friendly to the colony, probably something like Georgia or South Carolina, or moved to Great Britain. If you ever saw the series John Adams or read about John Adams, he helped defend the British soldiers charged in the Boston Massacre. He railed against this one because he gave up a lot of his reputation to defend British soldiers in very pro or anti-British, pro-American, anti-British Massachusetts. He took a hit on his reputation for that, and then he sees this slap in the face where they're saying that you can't get a fair trial in New England. And then the Quartering Act, which allowed governors, royal governors, rather than the colonial legislatures, to find homes and buildings to quarter British troops. Again, the Quartering Act, the original Quartering Act, the decision of where to put the troops was left up to the colonies. How to pay for troops was left up to the colonies. Now this was going to be declared by the royal governors. So in response to the calling of the First Continental Congress, The British sent troops to seize powder and weapons because remember the First Continental Congress called for formation of militias. So they sent the British sent troops to seize powder and weapons at Lexington, Massachusetts in April 1775, leading to the Battle of Lexington and the shot heard around the world on April 19th, 1775. That's also that night, the 18th and 19th, is Paul Revere's famous ride. The British are coming, the British are coming. So the Second Continental Congress met for the first time in Philadelphia in May 1775, a month after the shot heard around the world, with George Washington was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the new army. There was an attempt to try to avoid war with Great Britain. One last chance. It was called the Olive Branch Petition, and this was in the end was rejected. And then the Lee, which was I think that was the Olive Branch Petition, was in July 1775. Obviously, nothing goes quickly in that time because messages had to be carried across the Atlantic, and then they had to wait for a reply, and so it was time consuming. So when that was rejected, the Olive Branch Petition was rejected in 1775. The Lee Resolution on June 7th, 1776, led to was the first calls for independence formalized in the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental, despite the holiday, the Second Continental Congress declared independence on July 2nd, 1776. And the ratification of the Declaration of Independence was on July 4th, 1776. So the Independence Day is actually July 2nd. July 4th is the celebration of the Declaration of Independence. And why that's considered a holiday, because that is at the time that it was actually formally, the Declaration was read out to the world. So that's why that was chosen over July 2nd. So I'm going to just read the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. If you have a chance to read it, it's got a lot of list of grievances in the middle. The beginning and the middle part, to me, or the beginning and the end part, are definitely interesting. But you need to read the middle section too, because that gives you context, especially as you lead up to the last one. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiances to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So, the last section is the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 7. It basically, this week, is seeing a lot of the fallout of the second Thomas Shoal incident of June 17th. That's the one where the what I call them is the Chinese Coast Guard pirates with their axes and their sticks and their spears and knives captured or seized two Filipino boats, poked holes on them, destroyed equipment. So that's the day that the Chinese Coast Guard pirates attacked Philippine naval personnel that were trying to resupply the Sierra Madre. So one thing that did happen or did not happen is that China They hadn't a chance when they, on June 15th, I'm sorry, I'll go back to it, is China declared that they will arrest any trespassers in the South China Sea. So, and this would be a 60-day sentence with no trial, and the Chinese Coast Guard would be responsible for enforcing this action. The Chinese have made no attempt to arrest anybody. They had an opportunity when they seized the Filipino sailors. They didn't arrest them. They turned them back over to the Philippines. They have not attempted to make an arrest anywhere else in the South China Sea, at least nothing that I have found. So despite this threat of June 15th to start arresting trespassers, they have not attempted to do so. The one thing has happened is that the Chinese have started conducting naval exercises in the West Philippine Seas, and including using one of their aircraft carriers, probably the least powerful of their aircraft carriers, sailing it close to the Philippines. I think it was close to the Luzon, but it was still in international waters. And the Philippines pretty much handled it in stride, saying that the Chinese were acting within international law, even though the West Philippine Sea is part of the Philippine exclusive economic zone. It is not something that the Philippines or any country can just shut off the sailing of ships through the region as long as they stay clear of territorial waters, which means waters close to the actual main part of the Philippines. So the Philippines played it pretty cool as well. It's like, okay, we know they're out there, we know they're operating, but they're doing within the rights of international law. Now, China was doing this as an attempt to further intimidate the Philippines, but the Philippines didn't take the bait and acted very cool towards this, just as China has not attempted to arrest anybody. They're kind of steering clear of each other to try to avoid another escalation. Though, again, China is trying to flex its muscles in the area. So the Chinese Coast Guard, so they're doing this flexing muscle, the Chinese Navy. So while they're doing this, the Philippines actually sent a resupply mission to the Escoda Shoal, including dropping off construction equipment. So while the Chinese Navy was peacocking all through the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, and up towards the in Japan and the Senkaku Islands, the Philippines were able to send 3 ships, Coast Guard ships, to resupply Escoda without the Chinese interfering. So now there is some repercussion, because I think the Monster, I can't remember what they call it, there's a very large Coast Guard ship, which obviously was a former naval ship, that is anchored off of the Escoda Shoal. So that's where the Philippines have been sending patrol ships as well to try to keep China from forming that artificial island there. So more to go on with the Escoda Shoal, but it was good to see that while China was out there strutting along all through the sea with their Navy, including their old Ukrainian-made aircraft carrier. I know it's Soviet Union made, but it was made in a port in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, I think, are the ones who actually sold it to the Chinese. So they're sending that aircraft carrier through there, and while they're doing all that peacocking, the Philippines just went ahead and resupplied it without any significant grandstanding. The Chinese did send a angry letter to the Philippines stating that they did not appreciate that the Philippines were interfering in Chinese sovereignty in the South China Sea. So one thing that we did see is that the Chinese Coast Guard is expanding its operations, and the Navy is they've sent vessels to the Japanese Senkaku Islands, which, again, like everything else, China claims as their own. and threatened Japanese fishermen. The Japanese Coast Guard, in return, ordered the Chinese vessel to leave, and they eventually did leave without incidents. So this was probably a signal, because the Japanese and the Philippines are supposed to conduct meetings, and they actually had pre-meetings this week to discuss improving defense and security agreements. On July 8th, the Japan, starting on July 8th, they announced that they were going to have what's called their 2-on-2 meeting, which is their foreign secretaries and their defense ministers of each side will talk about common defense and security issues. So they had pre-meetings to talk about these meetings, and that's when the Chinese Coast Guard sent those ships into the Senkaku Islands, probably as a form of protest to the Japanese getting closer to secure its alliances with the Philippines. So the primary goal of the meeting is to negotiate reciprocal access agreements. So these have already been negotiated. I think the formal signing, I think there's some, I'll take that back. They've been approved in principle. They're just working through the finalization of these agreements that will allow both countries to have expanded access to each other's territory. Biggest concern for China is Japan sending more advanced equipment into Philippine locations to help the Filipinos counteract activities of the Chinese. So that is a concern for the Chinese, because remember, the Chinese do not want any alliances formed in Asia outside of the ones they form. Obviously, when they form them with Russia, that's fine. That's a completely different thing. When they form BRICS, no, that's a completely different thing. They just don't want anybody else to do it. They want to be able to have freedom to do whatever they want, but they don't want any other countries signing any type of agreement, because the Chinese view that suspiciously as an anti-Chinese activity, or they'll say you're dividing up the world into alliances, which the Chinese already do. It's just the ultimate of ridiculousness when you hear these statements coming from China. It kicks back to my young days when I used to listen to Pravda in English. It was just so funny because the ridiculousness of it. That's what you feel like when you read some of these Chinese foreign ministry statements. It's a combination of Baghdad Bob and I can't remember Martin Short's character, that when he played I think it was Therm, a lawyer that always denied everything. So, and that's just what it reminds me of. It's the ridiculousness of China. So anyway, they are protesting the idea that the Philippines and Japan are looking at signing closer defense agreements, which obviously are going to be directed against China, because Philippines don't really have a issue involving North Korea. Pretty much they're agnostic on the North Korea situation. So obviously this alliance, I would agree, is directed more towards the Chinese activities in the disputes with both those countries, both Japan and the Philippines. Now, one thing that says, I talk about that the Chinese do not like any alliances being formed, and they are pretty adamant about that. And they want all issues to be discussed bilaterally with them, the Chinese. Obviously, the Chinese have all the advantages going into a bilateral agreement. They have the advantages of their large economy, of their powerful military, and they're certainly not restrained by rule of law either. So there's no standard that they won't change to their advantage, even if they turned around and used it a different way with another country. Standards doesn't matter. The rule of law doesn't matter to the Chinese. They just want to be able to bully anybody into their agreement. So only bilateral meetings. So the Philippines with China had created a a bilateral agreement to discuss issues in South China Sea, but this has not been used in quite some time. So they restarted these bilateral meetings. And so Philippine and Chinese diplomats did meet in Manila on July 2nd to take steps to de-escalate tensions in the regions. So this is actually all in the favor. Seems like a diplomatic win for the Chinese. They got that bilateral meeting that they've been demanding. So it seems like this is a political win for the political and diplomatic win for the Chinese. The Philippines side did say that there was some progress, but that they said they would relentlessly protect its interests and sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. The Chinese also came back and stated that their sovereign right of the South China Sea. So despite any progress, it was in name only, but they were talking, and that's a positive way to try to avoid escalations in most cases. Now, the reason why that these bilateral meetings is it wasn't as big of a political win as that's being made out to be is, first off, we talked about the Japanese and the Philippines working on security agreements. They offer the the United States and the Philippines have a defense agreement, and the U.S. reaffirmed that agreement in context of activities related to what happened in the Second Thomas Shoal. They said that did not raise to the level of causing to trigger the agreement, but it is concerning. So the Philippines are going into the discussions with the backing of the United States, the backing of the Japanese. So even though they're going in there and they're negotiating with the Chinese bilaterally, they cannot be pushed around militarily and to a lesser extent economically, because they're going into these negotiations that they still have these defense alliances and they are still having a relation with the number one economy in the world. So it's not like they're going in there alone. They do have that backing of two powerful countries that operate in the region, meaning Japan and the United States. So this is not a typical bilateral meeting that the Chinese truly wanted, but they really couldn't back off of it because they've been stating that they have to have these bilateral meetings. So it was not as big of a win as it appeared. They did not get what they wanted because they could not push the Philippines around because of the alliances the Philippines had formed. So not sure what's going to come out of it. They said they would continue to talk. I don't see any real progress being made on the issue. I think what China is relying on is they want some type of political instability in the Philippines, whether it's or a change of government through just normal election process that is a more Chinese-friendly government to get what they want. So I don't see them changing their tact with the Philippines. They may not be so upfront with another second Thomas Shoal incident June 17th, but they're not really going to change their tune. And what they hope for is some change within the Philippines, whether it's something that they can destabilize or just through the normal election process that brings about a friendly Chinese government. I don't think, even whatever administration does, I don't think that the Philippines are going to all of a sudden become a vassal to all the demands of China. I just don't see that happening. I think the Philippine people are, in my opinion, are too fiercely independent for that. I think they might find a government that might be more harsh to Chinese demands, might find a government that might be a little more willing to discuss Chinese demands, but I don't think they'll ever have a government that's going to give in and serve the Chinese interests in Manila. So I just don't see that happening. Now, I did see an interesting report, and I hope maybe I'll write about this in the next week or two, is that the U.S. is often just brings up the defense alliance, but they don't call out that they're going to inject that they will not call the defense alliance, whether with the Japanese or the Philippines. The U.S. is not coming out and says, China, if you do that again, this enacts the defense agreement. What they're doing is they're pushing it back to the local partners. And I think China Uncensored did a good article or good video on this and talked about the U.S. is not, it's backing, but it's probably the best way to say it is they're leading from behind. They're leaving it up to the partner countries, in this case Japan or the Philippines, to be the ones to call what is a violation of the treaty and what's not. And the U.S. is not doing any really role in there. So it's kind of creating a situation where the Philippines and Japan don't know what really that line is. They kind of think they know what the line is, but because the U.S. has not clearly equivocated what is a violation, it's allowing China to keep pushing the edges with the Philippines and the Japanese to determine what that line is for enacting the defense alliance. So it's an interesting point of view, one I hadn't really thought about, but does make this sense in that the U.S. is not they are helping form these alliances in Asia to counterbalance the Chinese, to a lesser extent the North Koreans, but they are not being unequivocal about, or they're just not saying specifically what triggers an alliance, triggers that alliance to be enforced. So it does feel very much like either Washington's trying to avoid some form of escalation, things spinning out of control, kind of like what they're doing in Ukraine, or they're taking a point of view is the U.S. will come back and back this up, but what's a concern by not stating what it is? Let's say something happens, some type of event happens in the Philippines, and the Chinese Coast Guard opens fire. Maybe it's better to say the Navy opens fire and kills some Philippine Coast Guardmen. Well, the Philippines might view that as truly enacting the defense pact, but if the U.S. has not specifically said, yeah, that's a violation, they don't really know. So it's and so the Chinese could push that line. Now, not saying that the Chinese will do that. The Chinese are not that reckless. Everything with them seems to be thought out as much as you can. And when you have so many variables of international relations, the Chinese seem to be more methodical than something like that. But it's leaving a source of ambiguity to our allies that they don't know what that line is that the U.S. will come in and defend them. So interesting to see that. Definitely go out there if you're interested in some of those topics involving China, including less extent to what Philippines, but just general philosophy. Go out there and watch China Uncensored on YouTube. It's on X as well. Definitely worth listening to. Puts a little bit of humor into it. So definitely worth hearing. So that is what we have for this week. Sorry for my foreign audience. Thank you very much for listening, but sorry that I did add 2 things about the United States in this, which might be boring you to tears, but it does matter to, I think they're important to both the American audience. And of course, got to talk about the Declaration of Independence. So that is it for today. No real changes. I did get one more. It's funny. I did get another follower. It's like, that's just how slow things go with Substack. I got one new subscriber, and then they turned around and left like 3 days later. Probably accidentally. I don't know. So anyway, didn't get that. Get some funny messages from about some of the videos. One saying that one of the videos that the king and queen on a chessboard were in the wrong location. It's It's like, oh, I'm glad you saw the point of that video. Another one saying that why would you post a video that cuts off in the middle? And the video was a video sample and specifically said that in the title with a link to go to the original article or the original video. So anyway, just some of those thoughts. I did post some stuff today about the Ukraine-Russian war. I expect to get some hate. Apparently so much so that there was deleted comments. Not that I deleted them, but I probably tend to think that they were probably so significant that Twitter actually, or X, had to take action on them. Par for the course when you talk about the Russian and Ukraine war. So go out there and read that article. Talk about it. We'll talk about it next week. I got one question about why I don't talk more about the Palestinian and Israeli war issues. I've written some about that, but this is one of those things that has just been absolutely kicked in the butt by so many different authors that have put good points of view out there. My initial comment was, I get enough hate from the Russians and Ukrainians. Why would I want more hate from the Israelis and the Palestinians? I will say that for the most part, in theory, I get what the Palestinians are discussing. In actual practice, I don't understand that the Palestinians have gone about this the wrong way, going all the way back to the Oslo Accords. So anyway, there's a lot of good writing on that. I don't want to get in. I have not really gotten involved in that because, again, you're talking about something that will just get lost in discussion. Is if I get into that area and out of niche topics, I will just get buried with my 21 subscribers and 23 followers. I will not stand a chance to get any type of airtime. So I have to kind of go into those niche subjects and avoid right now the flavor of the year of the Palestinian Israeli conflict. The other thing that irks me about that conflict is that there's constant calls for peace. I understand the need for the peace, which may come to a true negotiating table. Hopefully someday in our dreams that eventually this conflict will be resolved and everybody can go and lead something more productive lives than shooting rockets at each other and airstriking each other. That, again, I will go back and say I have a more favorable, I lean more towards Israel in the conflict. I do understand many of the arguments in theory coming from the Palestinians, but I don't write about that. But the biggest thing I go in there, and just a source of criticism, is the Ukraine-Russian war. We have all these calls for peace to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the need for a one-state, two-state solution, and bring that there needs to be a peace treaty. But there's no talk of a peace treaty for the Russian-Ukraine war. And I looked at some of the casualty figures, and of course, nobody announces their casualties in that war. But the casualties, and now it's also, I know it's been running longer than the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Gaza war. But I think it's something where 20 to 25 times more people have been killed and wounded in the Ukraine war than have been killed in the Gaza war. And nobody's putting near the effort for a peace treaty for the for ending the Ukraine war as much as they're putting towards the Gaza war. Now, I'm not getting into that there's conspiracy theories, but if war is war and you want to end the killing, maybe you want to try to end the killing on both sides. Especially when both wars seem to be somewhat of a no-win situation, or nobody's going to be satisfied with whatever the outcomes are with pieces on both sides. But anyway, go read that paper that I posted today. We'll talk about it next week. So kind of starting maybe a preview into next week's topics. So, yep, it's posted today. Go out there, read it. Just more talk about the pursuit of peace and the backlash that it has created in the world. So, again, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a supporter, whether you're a subscriber or a follower on Substack. If you are a follower on Rumble or YouTube, thank you as always. I ask that I hope to get, if you're listening, and less than, I think on Substack, less than half my readers are subscribers or followers. So it would be, so there's people out there that are reading my material. Give a thumbs up if you like it, whether it's on any of the thumbs. Again, we're playing a game with the social media companies. Likes help, views help, sharing helps, becoming a supporter through a subscriber on Substack. All that helps about getting me legitimacy, getting me higher up on the algorithms so that I can get my message out. So if you are not a subscriber or follower, please consider doing so. It would help me out. Also, there's paid subscriber options. Also, you can support me on Patreon. As I start getting more traction in those areas, I will start doing more exclusive content for paid subscribers and subscribers on Patreon. So again, thank you everybody who has read and the support that you've given me so far. I didn't look at the totals yet for this month to sit there and say how many views I've had, but it's many thousands of views, and I thank you very much, everybody, for that. So go out and have a great week. Please consider reading my articles or videos. Comment. I will respond back with comments as well. Oh, no, I take that back. I will refer to serious comments. I'm not going to refer to somebody saying a video that the king is sitting on the wrong chessboard or the wrong part of the chessboard. So I'm not dealing with that. So anyway, all of you have a great week. Thank you very much. And we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.